Steve Buchanan, Azure MVP. I want to say long time Azure MVP. It's getting to be a long time. Steve's not that old yet, frankly, but he's getting there. Steve's going to talk to us about Azure Policy Insights, and he's going to give us a multi-tag demo via Azure Policy. So Steve, I'm just popping down to see if you are in the list of panelists here with us. There, I see you. And I am going to push control over to you. And Steve, as you come on, let me just quickly here stop the previous recording. And why don't you go right ahead? Over to you, Steve.
All right, sounds good. Thanks everyone for joining the session today. I'm going to cover Azure Policy, and thanks Bert for covering governance. You know, governance in Azure is a huge topic, and Azure Policy is a sliver of that topic, but it's a critical piece. And so that's what I'm going to cover today, because we're going to use Azure Policy, right, to help us enforce our governance. I'll go a little bit into my background. So as Pete stated, I've been in the MVP program for a while, just received award for my 9th year. I'm based in Minnesota. You've probably seen Minneapolis in the news recently. We are known for other things besides police brutality and riots and protests. We're also known for prints, and we have a ton of lakes. It's a beautiful place here with a lot of nice people. I work for Avanade and Accenture, so very large organization. I'm in the consulting space, and I've done a few books. So the latest book is on actually Azure Kubernetes service. So let's dive right into the topic here. And so as you first journey into Azure, you want to sit down with your cloud ops team, or sometimes you'll have like cloud COEs. You want to sit down and you want to really go through your governance plan and map those things out. And that's not always, you know, the most exciting part of cloud, right? A lot of us want to get in there, get our hands on the keyboard, start doing infrastructure as code and doing some of the fun stuff, right? But if you skip the governance piece, your Azure cloud environments are going to be the wild, wild west, and you will run into problems. Your organization will have, you know, large bills, and you'll have other complications as well. And so you want to put that governance plan together. And after you put that governance plan together and that strategy, then you want to look at Azure, because Azure has a lot of native tooling that can help you implement that governance plan and put that governance plan into place. One of those tools is Azure Policy. And with Azure Policy, we can go ahead and take our policies that we've mapped out in the governance, and we can actually use Azure Policy to enforce those, or even just audit and monitor for those policies and those controls, right? So with Azure Policy, you can go ahead and create, you can assign, manage, or you can apply what's known as policy definitions. And later on in the deck, I'm going to go through what policy definitions are. And I'm also going to go into a demo and give you like a visual on policy definitions. And then as I kind of alluded to with Azure Policy, you can kind of turn it on so that it's just monitoring for, you know, things that are out of compliance, or you can have Azure Policy set so that if things are out of compliance, it can go ahead and remediate those for you. And that's speaking directly to the second bullet point there. And then with Azure Policies, you can apply those at the management group level, subscriptions, and resource groups. And you can essentially have one of 5 types of effects, right? So you can do an audit, you can have a deny. So a deny would be if someone goes to create a resource, and let's say you have an Azure policy that says, hey, you can only create the resources in the central US, and someone tries to create a resource in Microsoft's region in France or somewhere else, right? It can block that person from even being able to create that resource. So you can ensure that, you know, those resources are deployed where you want them to be. There's also modify. That's a really good one, and that's actually what I'm going to use in my demo. And then disabled and append. So general uses for Azure Policy, and again, this is just kind of a sample. This is not an exhaustive list. You can do a ton of stuff with Azure Policies, but the common ones that you know I typically see and typically do on projects are, of course, requiring tags, and I'll go into tags and what tags are. Geo compliance, so I use that in my previous example, right? Making sure that resources are deployed in specified regions. Cost controls, so you can actually put Azure Policies in place so that, like, you know, let's say if you're not running SAP in your organization, you don't want someone deploying the humongous VMs that are on Azure to support SAP, right? Those are going to cost a ton of money every month, and you don't even want to risk those being deployed. So you can have an Azure policy put in place that can block that, so an accident can't even happen. And then configuration best practices. So this could be best practices that you come up with, you know, for your organization, your controls, or like I have listed there, if you're following NIST, right? Or if you have PCI compliance, ISO, high trust, HIPAA, and the list goes on, FedRAMP. Microsoft has built out a set of policies that you can just go and leverage to put in place to make sure your environment on Azure meets, you know, PCI compliance or meets high trust or HIPAA. And that those policies can be centered around the resources that you have deployed in Azure. The last one there is the secure, and I have AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service, networking, SQL and app service, and really you can secure your environment down to the service level, right? So Microsoft actually has, again, built-in default policies that you can leverage if you want to, or you could go with custom policies that are specific to like Kubernetes or specific to your Azure networking or SQL running on Azure. And I'd highly recommend that you look at these and evaluate those to see what you could leverage and save yourself time. And speaking of that, I just have a couple of slides that kind of give an example of some of the built-in policies that you could leverage. And we'll see some of this in the portal when we go in there as well. But this is just a small sample of what's available in regards to policies to support NIST. So if your organization has a goal to adhere to security according to the NIST standards, you can start here. You don't have to go from a blank slate, right? And you could see a lot of these policies are pretty straightforward too, and things that you should be doing anyway, like your function apps should have SSL. Here's a sample of some of the policies that are available for PCI. Something to note here too is that there are a lot of overlapping policies. And so again, we see the function app should be only accessible over HTTPS, right? So we saw that on the list for NIST as well. And I didn't try to rhyme there intentionally. And here's an example of some of the policies that are available for Azure Kubernetes Service. And again, this is just a super small sampling, but I want to call out two things with this. The first thing is this is still in preview. I think it's in public preview at this point. And it's been out there for a while. And so it's pretty stable. I would recommend using this and trying this out. And I know the teams at Microsoft are working very, very fast to bring this to GA. And they're just making a lot of enhancements to this. It's a really great service to bring to your Kubernetes from a security standpoint, and honestly lift some of the weight off of your shoulders. You know, there's certain things on here that are super useful, like enforce SSL on your ingress for your Kubernetes cluster, right? Or enforce labels if you're using those for your pods in your Kubernetes cluster. So there's a lot of good things here. And the second thing I wanted to call out is these Azure policies apply to the Kubernetes cluster, but they also go down to like the pod level and can help you there. So you see from the example that some of the policies can apply like for your networking with your AKS, but also can apply to your pods. And then here, I think this is pretty well known now, but there may be folks out there that still don't know this, but Security Center is leveraging Azure Policy. So when you turn on Security Center for your cloud environment, it's using Azure Policy to basically monitor for compliance and the security posture of your Azure environment. And so we see that with other services too, where they're leveraging Azure Policy kind of as the underlying pain and technology to help, right? So this is pretty cool. So you'll notice, you know, in Azure Policy, there's a ton of Security Center, you know, Azure policies. They're categorized under Security Center. Now, you may ask, like, okay, if I use the built-in policies, how does that impact me if Microsoft changes those? Well, that's actually a common question, and a lot of organizations will opt to go ahead and use the built-in policies kind of as a starting point, and they'll duplicate them, but then customize the copy. And there again, it's like, okay, how do I keep up with what Microsoft is doing? So this is a community-based website here, this AZ Policy Advertiser, and you can actually go out to this website and it tracks the changes for the Azure policies. And the site is pretty cool because you can flip between the different categories. So if you're concerned about, you know, the Azure Kubernetes policies or maybe the networking policies, you can go ahead and change the filter and see what's been updated for those specific policies. Now this is community supported, so you know, use at your own risk if that's the proper thing to say there. It is run by a Microsoft employee. However, again, this is a community-based website and tool. Another community-based solution that I wanted to bring into this deck and talk about today is this Azure Policy for Diagnostics. So a common need when you're deploying things in Azure is to turn on the diagnostics, right? So you can get the metrics and you can get logs and get that data from log analytics, or maybe you want to send it to Event Hub, or just drop it in storage and you have some other tool to analyze logs. Well, that can be a monumental task if you have a ton of resources in Azure. So you want to automate that and script that. So Jim Britt, shout out to him. He actually works for Microsoft. He built a series of scripts to help you automate this process. And so they're listed there, and the link is there too for his GitHub repo on this. Full-blown documentation, so it's pretty awesome. Again, he works for Microsoft, but this is a community based solution, but it's super useful and it's been around for a while now. You can actually use it to go ahead and create the custom policies for your environment for basically configuring the diagnostic metrics and logs. And then you can choose if you want to send that to Log Analytics, or maybe you want to send it to Event Hub. If you run through the scripts, the first one will create those custom policies, and what it's creating for you is ARM templates, and then it gives you the exported artifacts. And so you'll take those, and in step 3, you would import those into Azure, and then you could assign them from there. And you could create just policy definitions or policy definition initiatives, and I'll cover what that is in coming slides. And then he's got 2 final scripts there, number 4 and number 5. Number 4 is a script that will speed up the evaluation for compliance against your resources. And I'll kind of talk about that, and I'll bring that in the demo as well through Cloud Shell. And then the last one is just speeding up the time for remediation. But highly recommend leveraging this resource or this solution. Again, remember, it's community-based. Now, when folks are new to Azure and when they're new to Azure Policy, a lot of times they'll ask, well, I have RBack. Do I really need policy? Or, what happens if I'm using, if I've customized and really configured my RBack, is it going to conflict if I start using Azure Policy? And the answer is absolutely not. These are designed to work together. If you have policy in place and you should be using RBack, the user has to get past the RBack restrictions first, and then they're going to hit the policy. So policy is going to restrict the actions that the user can perform, right? And RBack's going to control the access to things. So you can see in the diagram, we kind of have RBack on the outer rim, and that's the first barrier for users getting into Azure and getting access to your resources. And then when they get past that, when they've authenticated, they'll hit those Azure policies, right? And that'll do things like restrict where they can deploy, as far as a region, or if they can deploy massive virtual machines, or what they can and can't do. So they work together. Now let's talk about the structure of Azure Policy. So the Azure policies themselves, you can build them out in ARM templates. And here's the basic structure, right? So you have your condition. So that'd be like, can I do this? Can I do this? And then your logical operator. So if we think in terms of location, this would be your locations that you're going to maybe allow, or your locations that maybe you're going to deny, or not allow. And then you'll have your effect. And if you remember back to the beginning of this presentation, there's 5 different types of effects. So for example, you could do a deny, or you could do an audit here, right? Now here's what it looks like all put together. And again, this is like very, very simple. We can get really, really complex with our Azure policies, and go out and check out like Stan's blogs. He presented earlier. He's done some amazing stuff with Azure Policy as well as Tau. And I don't know when he's presenting, but he's got some really great stuff for Azure Policy as well. And check out his blog and his GitHub repo as well. So shout out to both of those guys. So putting it all together, so let's go through this. So you have your if, and you're not there, so that would be your condition. If not, the location is in North Europe or West Europe, then deny it, right? So super simple. So you could actually take this and you could take out North Europe, West Europe. You could put in like Central US, South Central US, and use this to deny. Now, this is an important one, right? Like, okay, we've talked about Azure Policy and what it can do, and we've looked at the structure, but how does this apply, right? What are the stages for taking my Azure Policy and actually putting it to work? And let me go through a couple of things before we go through the stages. So with Azure Policy, you have what's called definitions. And the definition is basically defining what the heck the Azure Policy is. So in the previous slide, that's what we did. We defined what our Azure Policy is. Now, with definitions, you can do a single definition. Maybe it's just one thing you need to do, or you can create what's called an initiative, and that will consist of, many definitions. So maybe you need to have a bunch of Azure policies, but they need to be grouped together because they're related in some way, and it makes sense to just create an initiative. So when I showed you like NIST, and when I showed you the PCI, those are like a bunch of policies bundled together to meet like NIST or PCI compliance or even ISO, right? So you can do that for your own organization. If you have a set of controls that will need to be there on every single resource, maybe it makes sense to create an initiative and bundle the Azure policies together. And then you have assignments. So we create the definition, and then we need assignments, and assignments are used to assign the definitions to your resources in Azure. And let's just kind of build out the workflow now. But so after you have the definitions, you have to go and create an assignment. Now you can do that from the Azure Policy definition itself, or you can go to the assignments and create an assignment from there. And again, you can have a single assignment or you can have an initiative assignment, right? And then after it's assigned, Azure Policy will go through its evaluation cycle, and it's evaluating your resources, and then it's gonna report back compliance. And that's the third step. So it's gonna tell you, hey, you have this policy that says that all of the resources in this particular resource group should have these tags. If those resources have those tags, then it's compliant. It's going to be green on your dashboard. If they don't, then it's going to be red. It's out of compliance. And so from there, you can have Azure Policy, just report that back to you. And then you go talk to the person that's out of compliance, right? And bring the hammer down. Or you can have it automatically remediate that. So let's put those tags in place. And that's actually what I'm going to go through as a part of the demo. So that covers the stages of Azure Policy. It's important to know this and understand this as you start to dive into Azure Policy. Now, something else I want to talk about is the Azure Policy guest configuration, right? And I know like Bert and Stan stole some of my thunder on this, but I want to talk about this as well because this is super exciting. And we're not going to dive too deep into this. We could probably do an entire session on guest configuration. But this basically takes Azure Policy beyond Azure resources and takes it to, basically your servers, regardless if they're on premises, regardless if they're in AWS or GCP or running somewhere else. If they're connected through Arc, then you can use this Azure Policy guest. And what this does is it extends Azure Policy into the machine itself, so basically into the operating system. So I don't want to say it's a replacement for group policy, but in my mind, it's kind of heading that direction. And so this is pretty exciting because with this and with things like Arc, now you can have Azure Policy. You can start to utilize like update management, some of the change tracking, some of that stuff for your machines that exist outside of Azure. And this helps as well with like Kubernetes. So if you're running a Kubernetes cluster, on AWS or somewhere else, or you're leveraging, another Kubernetes managed service somewhere else, Arc helps you extend for that as well. Now, key point here on the Azure Policy guest configuration is that, like Stan stated earlier, this is monitoring only. So it's not applying any configurations yet. That's coming. But this is still a good tool to give you a picture and give you compliance around, is my environment compliant or is it out of compliance? How am I doing from a health standpoint, from a security standpoint? Now with Azure Policy Guest Configuration, there's something called validation, and the validation right now can validate three things, right? The configuration of the operating system. So most organizations, when they build out servers, they should have a build script. So a set of things that need to be done on every OS, right, to adhere to the organization's security controls. Application configuration, or even the presence of that application. So maybe there's an app that's supposed to be on all servers, or maybe there's an app that should be on all your web servers, and you want to use this Azure Policy guest configuration to ensure that that application exists on all of your web servers. Well, you could bring those into Azure Arc, and then you could use Azure Policy guest configuration to figure out if it's there or not. And then environment settings is the last one. Now, the validation tools for Azure Policy guest configuration are basically PowerShell DSC v2 and inspect by Chef. So the DSC is used on the Windows side, and Chef inspect is used on the Linux side. All right, let's get back to some of the Azure policy and the governance stuff, and let's talk about a scenario. So your organization is adopting Azure, or maybe you've had Azure around for a while, you've worked with the team and you finally settled on tags. And what tags are is basically just metadata about your stuff in Azure. At the lowest level and simplest terms, that's what tags are, right? And tags can be applied at the resource group or resources. Once you have tags in place, it's helpful when you're searching for things. If you're doing automation, maybe you have some scripts, you can hit a set of tags and run the automation against those tags. It's also helpful when you're trying to get a handle on cost, right? You can start to create reports or start to leverage the cost management in Azure to see what things are costing you. So if you're running, like, let's say an ERP application, you have web servers, maybe you have some storage servers, maybe you have some database servers, or even some databases that run on PaaS. Maybe you have networking resources like NSGs or other resources, and you want to know that all of these resources relate back to this ERP. Well, throw tags on all of the stuff that relates to it, and that'll help you get that insight that you might need down the road. Now, here's just a kind of a short list of common tags that organizations often use, right? So like bill to, so this thing is costing us money. Who's paying for this? The department, right? Environment's a popular one. Is this a dev environment? Is it prod? Is it, et cetera? And when you think about automation, you can start to leverage the tags to make sure you're hitting the right environment, because maybe you have everything deployed in one Azure subscription, but you still need to know what's dev, what's prod. By the way, I'm not recommending that you put everything in one subscription, just using that as a scenario. Application owner is a common one that's really good, and then project owner. So again, tags are metadata, and every organization is different, and every organization goes through and builds out their taxonomy for their tagging. And often this can be difficult discussions to have, right? Because people have different views and opinions on what tags should be used and what they should be used for, et cetera, et cetera. Those conversations can be challenging, but have them. Make sure you bake that into your governance plan because they will be helpful. All right, now you could go through the effort of creating the tagging strategy, right? You can spend all this time, get through those difficult discussions, and you have your tagging strategy and your taxonomy documented. That's great and that's wonderful, but what happens if no one uses them, right? Then your tagging strategy is worthless. I have seen this time and time again, where an organization will put a plan in place for governance, for tagging, and people are deploying stuff out in Azure and they're not tagging. And it's a problem because it's, you know, hard to find stuff. You don't know who owns what, you don't know who deployed what. So your tagging strategy is only helpful if it's actually being used. And if we've learned anything from human behavior, chances are people aren't going to put the tags in, right? So one of the ways we can enforce that is we can use Azure Policy. And that's why Azure Policy is critical to your governance when it comes to Azure, right? So we can ensure that the tags are put in place through Azure Policy. So we can remove that task from, you know, potential human error of just not doing it. Now, it's not going to be 100% perfect, but we can use the Azure Policy to reduce, you know, what they need to do. So in the past, and actually to this day, I still see organizations or folks that are working in Azure use the deny effect on their Azure Policy to enforce tags. So what that means is you go to the Azure portal and you go to deploy something, or maybe you're doing it through the CLI or Terraform or whatever. You go to deploy something and you don't have the tags, and so it blocks you, right? And you get this big fat error, but the error is not always clear. Like it tells you you were blocked because you don't have tags, but it doesn't tell you what the tags are. So it's like, okay, I tried to deploy this thing. It said I can't do it because I need the tags. I don't know what the tags are, so I need to go look in the governance, you know, document and sift through, you know, 100 pages to find it, and then go manually add these tags. It can be a pain, right? So what I've seen is, you know, folks will use the deny effect and then end up turning the Azure Policy off later. So there again, it's not helping you with your tagging strategy. Now, you can use something, you can use the append effect, right? So what that will do is if the resource is out there, it will go append the resource, basically adding the tag to it. The problem with the append is it could only do like one remediation at a time, or one remediation action. So it could only do like one tag. So you'd end up having a ton of Azure policies to enforce like, you know, 10 tags, which is just a pain. So Microsoft, they updated the modify effect so that the modify effect could handle multiple operations and basically remediate, you know, on those multiple operations and basically help you do multiple tags through one policy. And that's what we're going to go through in the demo. Now, before we get into the demo, one of the pain points of Azure Policy for a long time was like, okay, I'm building these definitions, I'm assigning them, and now I wait, and I wait, and I wait. And you end up waiting for the evaluation cycle before you could see if, okay, my Azure Policy actually worked, or, you know, it's not working, and now I need to go do some more coding to my definition. that was a pain. Well, we have this trigger a policy. We have this command where we can basically trigger the evaluation. And so this is awesome. It's in the Azure command line interface. What I'd recommend is just use Cloud Shell. I don't know if this exists for PowerShell or not, but just use Cloud Shell. It's amazing. If you're not using Cloud Shell, go start using it today. So I wanted to bring that up because it's important to know about that, especially when you're building out your Azure policies. Now, we're going to dive into a demo here, and hopefully everything works in the demo. Before we do that, I have a GitHub link there to an Azure policy that has like multiple tags in it. I think there's maybe like 10 of them in there. As an example, so you can go grab that from a GitHub repo. That's what we're going to use today, and you could use that as a starting point for your multi-tag strategy in your organization. You could just grab it. It's just a ARM template. You can grab that and modify it to your needs. So what I'm going to do here as we dive into the demo is I'm going to pull some tabs over to this monitor, and then we'll work through it. By the way, before we get into the demo, I wanted to bring this up and answer a question that came up in Bert's session. Can you do Azure Policy with Terraform? Yes, you can. There is a provider out there for Azure Policy. Have I done it? No. Do I see this often? I haven't seen a lot of it yet, but I'm sure this will become more and more common as Terraform's always used all over the place, and it's pretty amazing. But just wanted to answer that question before I forgot. So whoever asked that question, there's the answer. All right, let's dive into the demo here. And let me go back to my browser. Okay, so I'm in the portal and I'm in policy. That's how you get to it. And in policy here, I'm on the overview tab. You'll notice there's a bunch of different, I don't know what these are called, sections, right? So you have your overview where you can see everything. You can see like your compliance score. You can see, what things are out of compliance. You can see the details here. So this gives you some nice reporting here. There's this great getting started. So if you're new to Azure Policy, come in here and kind of go through this. This will link out to documentation and just give you some good recommendations. A really great resource. Earlier I mentioned like the Azure Kubernetes. And let's actually click off of that screen. But the Azure Kubernetes service is still in preview. So you would go to that join preview and sign up there. The compliance is just another view of the compliance here. And then you have remediation. So this is if things need to be remediated, and save that, save any thoughts here because we're going to come back to this as a part of the demo. And then the important ones that you have down here are the definitions and the assignments. So let me go into the definitions here. There's some really good stuff here. So, okay, you can see there's a ton of policies, right? There's a huge list as soon as we come in here. Now you have this filter up here. This is scoped to my 3 or 4 subscriptions that I have in here. And then you have like definition type. So you can say, okay, I only want to see initiatives, and there's a ton of them, or I only want to see policies, right? And there's way less of those. Let's do all. And then you have this type. So you can see like all the built-ins, or you could go to custom. And we're going to come back to custom. So basically this is where my stuff is. And so as you're building custom policies, that's where you'll see it. And then you have this tags up here. So this is really cool. And this is awesome that Microsoft is like, they continue to build out these Azure policies that we can use. And so we're not starting from scratch or scratching our heads trying to figure things out without any help, right? So let's say I'm running Fire. I'm running Microsoft's Fire service, which is a healthcare service, right? So I scoped it down to that. There's only one Azure policy out there for that, right? But at least I know, like, okay, I'm running Fire, and I want to see what Azure policies Microsoft already has for me that can help me with Fire. Also, you can see that I've added a category for my stuff called Buchanan. So I could actually scope down to that, right? Let's uncheck that, and we'll just show you like one more. So let's say we want to see what policies are available for Key Vault that can help me, make sure my Key Vault is secure. There we go. And you could grab one of these, you could duplicate it and start to customize it as you see fit. So let's go back to custom here. And what I want to do is go into the inside Azure management required tags, and we'll show you what this looks like. So again, I mentioned the link to my GitHub repo that has this Azure policy. So you can go grab that code and you can start working with it, right? But a couple of things in here. So it just gives you some data up here, which is good. You could assign this policy from here. Remember I said you could assign directly from a definition, or you could go into the assignments and assign it from there. You could edit this, you could duplicate it here. So if you were to click on a built-in Azure policy, this is what you would do, is you would click on duplicate definition, grab it from there and start to work with it. The other thing you could do is Microsoft maintains a GitHub repo of all of the Azure policies, all of the built-in Azure policies. So you could actually go out to the GitHub repo and just grab them from there and start working with it from there in VS Code. By the way, VS Code is highly recommended. Start working with them from VS Code, and then just add your Azure policy, either from VS Code or through one of the scripts that Jim Britt has, or you could do it through the portal. You could delete from here too. So in here, we can see the definition, kind of what's in there. So you can see, okay, here's the name of it. It's custom. Mode is going to be based on all. It was created by me. Created by. This is a GUID. You'd have to track that back, but it's still nice to have that data. And then here are the tags, right, that I want to put in place. So I've just kind of defined them there. And then if we keep going down, here's the policy rule. So it's basically checking to see if that field exists, to see if the tag exists. And then it's going to do an action, right? So it's going to use the modify effect. And then it's just coming through and it's just replacing or adding, right? So actually pretty straightforward. We could click here and see the assignments. You can see I have this assigned to 2 resource groups. There's a reason for that. And then you could come in here and see the parameters. So sometimes it's hard to see or tell what the parameters are through code. So this just kind of gives you a nice visual what the parameters are. So like if this was a deny policy on locations, you could come in here and see what the locations are. All right, so let's pop back out here and let's pop into the assignments. By the way, there's the related services down here are great too. We're not going to talk about these services today, but these are used for governance as well. Good stuff there. So as I pop into the assignments, again, I have this like filter bar up here, which is nice. And then I have some options up here where I can assign policy or initiative. And then what I want to do here is just scope this down to policy. But before I do that, I actually want to show you this. So this initiative here is tied to security center. So you can see that category right there. You can see that there's 103 policies in there, right? So just to point that out and give you that example. So I scoped it down to policy, and for the definition type, and these are my assignments, right? So I could actually click into either one of these, and let's click into this one here. And basically, it gives us a chance to come in here and edit this. So you can see I have this scope to subscription and then a resource group. I can't change this. I'd have to delete this assignment and then create a new one. Now, keep in mind, if I delete this, it doesn't delete the definition. So it doesn't impact or touch my definition, which is cool. It's really nice. I wish, and I don't know if someone from Microsoft is listening, but it'd be really nice if we could like pause or, like pause these assignments without having to delete them and then like unpause them. That would be a really great feature. Here's your assignment name, ID, and then, oh, you know what? This might have actually answered my request. So you can enforce or disable the enforcement here. That doesn't answer my question, but the beauty of cloud is you come in here and you see new stuff all the time. And then here you could see like the parameters. So you could come in here and modify this too. So as this is assigned, if you changed it here, this would, be modified on the resources you have this applied to. So again, if this was a location policy, we'd see the list of locations. Or if this was a policy that was like deny, don't allow anyone to provision a certain type of resource, like let's say public IPs, that's a common Azure policy, then you would see a list of the Azure services and you would see public IP checked, and you could modify that here. In here we have remediation, so we can tell this to remediate or not remediate, etc. So let's pop back out to here, and what we're going to do is I'm going to take you over and show you a couple of resource groups. So this is my first resource group here for the inside Azure management, and you can see we have the tags. Right, so I didn't manually add these tags. I created the resource group, and then I created the assignment and assigned it towards this resource group and told Azure Policy to remediate. And then I ran the, evaluation, and about, I don't know, 15 minutes later, these were there. So it was pretty amazing, automated, and I didn't have to do anything there. Now, on this resource group number 3, you can come in here and you can see that I don't have any tags here. Right, so let's go back to the resource groups. And what I want to show you is, let's go to definitions, and we're going to assign the definition to that second resource group here, just to show you what this would look like. So you click on assign, and then that's our account. We don't want to have any exclusions. By the way, exclusions are like, maybe you're applying this at a subscription and you want to exclude certain resource groups or something like that. You could certainly do that. And I'm just going to add 02 to the end of this, and then enabled, and then we'll go next. We're going to leave these all the same, and then remediation here. So if I left this unchecked, Azure Policy would check for the compliance, but if something's out of compliance, it's not going to remediate it, right? So what I'm going to do is select the remediate, and there's my policy, and then Central US, and it's using a managed identity. And then there's the permission there that's going to use. So that's it. And then you just create this. It's pretty fast. And then that would be in place. So let's close these alerts. And now if we go back to assignments, or actually let's jump out to compliance, because I want to show you something with the remediation. So you can see in the compliance, and let me scope this down to policy and expand this. So you can see on that first resource group that I showed you, it's compliant, right? It was enforced. On this last one, it's not compliant. It doesn't have the tags. So if I go into this, you can see there's my item that's not compliant. So if you had this applied maybe at a subscription level, and there was 50 resource groups there, you're going to see all 50, if they're out of compliance, you're going to see them in here. And then you have a couple of options here. You can go to compliance reason. You could look at the activity logs, because sometimes things are sometimes things are compliant, and then after a while, for whatever reason, they move out of compliance, right? So you might have some drift. But if I go in here, we can see the reason, and you can see the actual tags that should be there. So that's kind of helpful. Now you have options here. These are pretty straightforward, but you have this create remediation task here. So you have to have the actual resource highlighted, and then you could click on the create remediation task. This is if you didn't check the box when you created the assignment to remediate the task. You could come in here and do this. And then in here, I can click on this, and actually I don't want to, that's going to show me the resource. But what I want to do is just go ahead and remediate it. So when I click on that, it's actually going to create a remediation task, and then Azure Policy will attempt to remediate whatever that issue is. Right, so you can see, okay, it's in progress. So you could come back here and check later and see how it's doing. You also could cancel, or you could view the actual remediation task. You have events here as well as another tab. So let's go back to the dashboard. And you can see there's our resource group that we, or the second assignment for the second resource group, again, that didn't have the tags, right? So now it showed up, and it hasn't started yet. So it's not running it hasn't gone through the evaluation yet. So the syntax that I showed you earlier, the Azure command line to run the evaluation, you could actually go into Cloud Shell by clicking on this. This will give you a command prompt, and you could do PowerShell or Bash, and then you could run that, and it'll kick off the evaluation like right away. So it's pretty awesome. So I think that's it for the demo. Let's jump back to the deck here, and that actually brings us to the end of my session. So I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, Pete.
You're good. You're 7 minutes left on your window here for talking. So we've got plenty of room for questions.
Nice.
Frog in my throat there. Yeah, we've got plenty of room for questions, and we actually have some questions. So let me just pop out the questions pane here. So just to recap, the question around Terraform. So if we have an org that's using Terraform, do you see them using Terraform to implement Azure Policy then?
Have I seen it a lot? Not yet. I do think that organizations will start using it more and more. What I typically see is, folks just using the Microsoft tools. So like either using the portal, kind of like what I demoed, or using just like ARM templates or the scripts from Jim Britt, just using that.
Yeah, so there's a follow-up question there, and that's on the topic of Terraform. So I'd mentioned earlier that you have some Terraform expertise. Would you recommend that an organization that's only using Azure leverage Terraform instead of ARM? Is there a strategic advantage to that?
The question that always comes up around Terraform.
I know my answer. I want to hear your perspective on this. So I know you're definitely pro Terraform, and it's got a lot of traction, and even inside Microsoft, I see a lot of folks in the Microsoft field talking about Terraform. So
yeah, it comes down to preference. However, what I tell anybody that's diving into Terraform to do, even if you're Azure only or even if you're multi-cloud, I tell folks, learn ARM. You need to know ARM. You need to know how Azure works, like under the hood, down to that level. You should spend some time working with ARM templates. You should at least be comfortable in them. Terraform is awesome, and you know, it's easier to use. It's easier for folks that are new, maybe to infrastructure as code, than ARM. ARM can be harder to read if you're not used to it, like just JSON in general. And so a lot of folks, kind of lean towards Terraform for that reason. However, there's a lot of value in learning ARM. And one of the reasons is Terraform is always like one step behind ARM. So Microsoft's releasing services, and it's built on top of ARM. So ARM supports it. So ARM templates, right, will support it. Where if you're using Terraform, there might be a newer service, or there's a few services that have been out there for a while, and it might not be a part of the provider on Terraform yet, right? So you might end up using an ARM template anyway if you have to automate. And so I think it's important to learn both, and you should learn ARM. Now, if you're just doing Azure, I like to do a lot of PowerShell too. I don't know, I kind of bounce around, right, between ARM templates, PowerShell, and Terraform. But like, for example, there was a question earlier, Pete, where someone asked, like, why didn't you use ARM templates to deploy your Kubernetes cluster?
Right. When Ryan's session, exactly.
Yep. Well, I ran into problems with that. And it just, to be very transparent, doesn't work well. It sucks. So I started using the Azure CLI to deploy all of my AKS clusters, and that's what I go with now. Like my automations and stuff, it's all like Azure command line interface and like bash scripting. Like I do the same thing that the presenter from earlier does.
So,
right?
So Steve, at 3:27 p.m. Central Standard Time, I just went from liking Steve Buchanan to loving Steve Buchanan. So I use Azure CLI, and Ryan and I have done a fair bit of work together, inside and outside of work settings, and we originally went to Azure CLI because we were working with an organization that didn't understand ARM. They had never used Azure, but they did use Bash. And so it was a good first step. But once we got in there and saw the complexity of the scenario, for exactly the reason you said, we leaned into Azure CLI because it was easier and more reliable. And when we put it into the pipeline, it was release pipeline friendly.
Yeah, 100%. And something that I've created recently, and it's on my GitHub repo, is a script that fully automates the deployment of an ingress controller for AKS, the application gateway ingress controller. And if you crack that script open, it's a bunch of Azure CLI, it's bash scripting, right, with sed commands, and then I have like some Helm commands in there as well. And I was able to put all of that into one script. And what I do is run it from Cloud Shell, and I run it from, Bash, Cloud Shell, and it all runs. And I mean, it's amazing, right? And I'm able to like do stuff with Helm, and I'm able to do stuff with the Kubernetes cluster itself, and I'm able to do stuff with Azure. Now, if I tried to do all that with an ARM template, I'd be ripping out my hair and going crazy.
Yeah, there you have it. And on that note, so to summarize a couple of things Steve said, because I get this question a lot and I have pretty strong feelings about it. So if you're only running Azure, the benefit of Terraform, if you don't learn ARM first, is going to be fairly limited. And then I would question the value of Terraform in a single cloud platform environment. Once you know the native language, once you know ARM reasonably well. If you're only all in with Azure, Terraform runs on ARM. I heard somebody actually say Terraform deploys to Azure faster than ARM, which made me laugh because that would be impossible and counter to everything we've seen. But Terraform is great when you get into multi-cloud scenarios, or scenarios where maybe you have large teams and you need to break down you have those silos where maybe the scope of somebody's responsibility is served very well by Terraform. But what Steve mentioned about always being a step behind can sometimes mean a year behind.
Yes.
So I was having a conversation with somebody the other day working with Terraform in a large environment, and they wanted to turn on transparent data encryption in Azure SQL, and discovered that 3 years after the request had been opened on the Terraform support forums, it had not yet been implemented. And so they were basically going to be wrapping an ARM template in Terraform. So it wasn't a net positive in that case. It was more complexity.
And you will, when you're using Terraform, you will run into odd issues and scenarios like that. It doesn't mean that Terraform's bad, but just know that you will run into issues like that. Hence the reason why you should learn ARM, and you should dive into some of the native Azure tooling like CLI and learn PowerShell, etc.
Yeah, definitely not a bash on Terraform. If Terraform were mine, I would wear a Terraform shirt everywhere. And talk to everybody about it. No, it's fantastic, but it's got its place, and I think you need to evaluate your tool set and know what those criteria are before you dive in. So I want to make sure we get to all the other questions, because one of our first ladies of AI comes on in about 15 minutes. So Robert had a question here: is there a reporting feature for policies to create reports for compliance, for example?
Not that I know of.
So Robert, you said compliance, so I'm going to throw something out there, and I'm going to talk about this in the reference architecture discussion later. Steve mentioned it. Azure Security Center uses policy under the hood, and it supports multiple compliance standards. 4 are enabled by default. You can turn on others, and you can create your own. If you happen to be with me at 6 p.m. tonight, and I see you on here, I'll make a point to show you a couple of things there. But if I was looking for a reporting feature to drive action in my environment, what Steve mentioned, Security Center.
Yeah, and Pete, I was going to go there too. Those reports, right? So Security Center has PCI, ISO, NIST reports that you can generate. I don't want to steal your thunder, but yeah,
No, go for it, man. I'll talk around you. I've only got 45 minutes plus Q&A time, so yeah.
Gotcha.
Whatever
But
you
yeah,
want.
great reports there actually, and I would leverage those. If you need those reports, like you can export those as PDFs, and that's something you could send to your managers or auditors if you need to. But test it out, try it out before you just rely on that. You need to make sure that it fits your needs, right? It's in Security Center, so it's sort of pre-built, and so I don't know how customizable those are, if they're customizable at all.
Yeah, I'll hit that tonight. So yeah, Robert's in Europe, so he's gonna be down, but I'll make sure we circle back there. So the German delegation, Mr. Baumgarten, just says great session, thank you. And Manjit says, how about Chef for Windows?
I didn't turn on my video, but I'm actually wearing my Chef DevOps shirt right now, where it's showing like devs and ops like high-fiving each other.
All right, man. Let's see your video. Let's see it. Come on.
You gotta see it. Okay. All right. Let's
And
see.
while we're there, Manjit, I should connect you with Ryan Arujo, who spoke earlier. He and I wrote a book on Azure and Chef a couple of years ago, and Ryan still works with Chef quite a lot, so he may have some thoughts for you there. But I would say, generally speaking, I don't work with Windows in Azure very much. It's mostly it's mostly PaaS and non-Windows IaaS, Kubernetes. So, Steve, are you doing much with Chef and Windows?
Not at all. Yeah, not at all. Mostly what I see out there is Ansible these
Okay.
days.
I can spell Ansible, but I've not used it. So Manjit, what I'm going to do is just I'll copy your email here, and I'm going to connect you with Ryan, and let's have a chat about that. So Ryan and I know we've done a fair bit with Chef and Linux, and Ryan can run circles around me when it comes to Chef, but we can definitely bridge the gap there. And all right, Steve, let's see your shirt here. Kind of lean out from behind your mic. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Better together. All right.
Yeah, you got the dev and you got the ops. They're high-fiving each other, so it's all love. Right?
I like it.
I seen that shirt from Chef. I was like, I have to get one of those.
Okay, Dean has a quite good question here. Are there any recommended governance plan templates?
Governance plan template. So Microsoft has the cloud adoption framework. It's a bunch of documentation. Go out there and grab that. It's awesome. It's a great starting point. Also blueprints, right? So Microsoft has created a number of blueprints, and I believe there's one for the cloud adoption framework, and you could start with that. So what that is, I don't know if we had a session on blueprints or if we're going to have one. But blueprints consist of RBack, Azure Policy, and ARM templates. So you can actually use that to deploy in Azure environment with all, using all of those things. And so Microsoft's created these templates of these blueprints, and you can use those to get started.
Yeah, there you go. No, you're it for the policy today. Other than where I'll poke into that in a bit in Security Center a little later this evening. Let's see here, and I think we're close. Bear with me here. I'd parked a couple of questions from Bert's session here. I want to make sure we covered all of those. So just to go back on this question, because Bert I think deals more in process and strategy. So we had a question come up around, would we be using ARM templates to deploy our governance, our initiatives, and storing those in a Git repository for versioning purposes?
That's a good question, and I think that's an ongoing debate, right? So I mentioned blueprints. You can actually store, or you can have your Azure policies bundled in your blueprints. So that's one option. Another option is, yeah, you could store those in a GitHub repository and like leverage GitHub Actions, or you could actually store those in Azure DevOps in a repo there and leverage that for deploying. Now, shout out to Brian Moore, who works, he's a part of the ARM team at Microsoft. He actually has some examples and some stuff on using Azure DevOps for your governance through infrastructure as code. He's got some really good stuff there. And you could actually use that if you didn't want to use blueprints, because in blueprints, you have versioning, but the versioning doesn't work the same way that it does in Azure DevOps. And we'd have to go into a sub-session to kind of break that down. But Azure DevOps is going to give you, like most people, when they think of versioning, they want what they can get from Azure DevOps.
Yeah, I think it's a fair answer. So Robert's got one more question here. Can we use policies to audit, modify on every setting property of an Azure resource, or is there a limitation on what types of resources and properties can be checked?
There are limits. I don't know like the details to that answer. I'd have to go dig that out. That's a big question.
Robert, I'm gonna park this one so we can, and I'll circle back and throw Hubert and Steve and I on a thread, and we'll owe it to you to give you a couple of pointers, okay? Because yeah, that to Steve's point, I think that's one of those topics that's so big and moving so fast. You just can't have your head fully around that all the time. So Steve, that is the end of the queue, I think. Wait, nope. Robert's got one more.
Okay. Keep them
What's he
coming,
say?
Robert.
Oh, he says we would mostly standardize PAS deployments, etc., and check it with policies.
Got it. Yeah. So policies, you can use them for PAS. In my demo, when I did the drop down around, I think it was services, you could see some PAS services in there, right? So you could totally use Azure Policy with those PAS services.
Yeah, amen, Robert. I work in a small org. We are cloud first. I have IaaS up only for software testers, and when I want to demonstrate things for people. So we're 100 in a practical sense, we are 90 something % PAS, and we use policy wherever we can. So yeah, good points, Robert. I'm still going to just circle us all on a thread if you don't mind. And Steve, I'm going to take over from you here just to set the stage for Ms. Moniz. Let's see here. Alicia,
Awesome.
you were on twice, but thanks for a great session, Steve, and you used all your time, so congratulations there.
Thanks, Pete.